Amara Jackson's world shatters the day her brother, Malcolm, is publicly humiliated and falsely accused of cheating. In a town controlled by the ruthless and corrupt school board member, Richard Thornton, the Jackson family is pushed to the brink. Determined to clear her brother's name and uncover the truth behind her father's mysterious death years ago, Amara embarks on a relentless quest for justice. As Amara delves deeper, she uncovers secrets that powerful people would kill to protect. With allies in unexpected places, and betrayals lurking around every corner, Amara must navigate a web of lies, corruption, and danger. But the closer she gets to the truth, the higher the stakes become, not just for her, but for everyone she loves. In a race against time, Amara must confront her own fears and face impossible choices. Will she expose the truth and bring down the man who destroyed her family, or will Thornton's empire crush her before she gets the chance? Based on a true story. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The high school auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and curious parents, all seated in neat rows under the blinding fluorescent lights. Whispers filled the air, a low hum of gossip and speculation as the crowd awaited the principal's announcement. Tension hung heavy, and the only sound that cut through the chatter was the sharp tap of shoes on the wooden stage. Amara Jackson sat stiffly in the audience, her eyes darting anxiously between the students seated beside her and the stage where her younger brother, Malcolm, stood with his head bowed. She could see the tremble in his hands as he clutched the sides of his jeans. The 16-year-old boy, once so full of confidence, now looked like a fragile shell of himself. Principal Stevens adjusted the microphone, clearing his throat. Behind him stood Richard Thornton, the imposing school board member who was known throughout the town for his ruthless discipline and disdain for families like the Jacksons. Thornton's cold blue eyes surveyed the crowd with a look of satisfaction, as if he were savoring the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering on such short notice," Principal Stevens began, his voice echoing through the hall. "We are here to address a serious violation of our school's honor code." Amara's grip tightened on the armrest of her seat. She could feel the eyes of her classmates boring into her, eager to witness whatever spectacle was about to unfold. She glanced over at her mother, who sat beside her, hands clasped in silent prayer. This was a nightmare. Stevens continued, "Today, we must set an example. Malcolm Jackson, a student many of you know, has been caught cheating on a major exam." Gasps rippled through the audience, followed by whispers. Malcolm's face turned ashen, his eyes wide with disbelief. "That's a lie," Amara muttered under her breath. She could barely contain herself, her body tense to spring forward and defend her brother, but her mother's firm hand on her arm held her back. Thornton stepped forward, his presence commanding instant silence. "This kind of dishonesty cannot be tolerated," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate off the walls. "For too long, certain individuals in this school have been given a free pass. Today, we put an end to it." Amara's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to scream, to rush up to the stage and yank her brother away, but she knew that doing so would only make things worse. Thornton had the power to make their lives a living hell, and she was all too aware of his influence. Due to the severity of this offense, Thornton continued, his lips curling into a cruel smile, "We have decided on a punishment that fits the crime. Malcolm will be made an example of, to remind everyone here what happens to cheaters." Malcolm's eyes darted desperately to Amara, his silent plea for help making her stomach churn. Principal Stevens gestured to two teachers standing by the side of the stage. They stepped forward, their faces devoid of emotion, and handed Malcolm a cardboard sign with the words, "I am a cheater," scrawled in thick, red letters. "Take off your clothes, down to your underwear," Thornton ordered, his voice merciless. "Then put on the sign." The room went deadly quiet. Even the whispers stopped, as if the entire auditorium had collectively forgotten how to breathe. Amara's heart dropped. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Please, no," Malcolm whispered, shaking his head, tears streaming down his cheeks. But the teachers moved closer, forcing him to comply. "That's enough." Amara leapt to her feet, unable to stay silent any longer. "You can't do this. He's just a kid." Her voice shook with rage, her vision blurred by tears of fury. But Thornton only smiled, his eyes locking onto hers with a look of triumph. "Sit down, Miss Jackson, or I will have you removed from this school," Thornton warned coldly. "This is what happens when someone thinks they can cheat the system. Your brother will learn his lesson today." Amara's mother grabbed her arm, pulling her back down. "Amara, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We can't fight them here. Not like this." Reluctantly, Amara sank back into her seat, tears of helplessness streaming down her face. She watched as Malcolm, trembling uncontrollably, stripped down to his underwear. The laughter and taunts from the students were like daggers, each one piercing Amara's heart. She could see Malcolm's spirit breaking with every snicker, every camera phone capturing his humiliation. With the cardboard sign hanging around his neck, Malcolm stood on the stage, exposed and humiliated, his eyes glazed over as if he had retreated deep inside himself to escape the pain. Thornton turned to the audience, his voice booming. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. Cheaters will not be tolerated." Amara clenched her fists so tightly her nails dug into her palms, drawing blood. She felt rage like she had never known before. This wasn't just about a cheating accusation, it was about power, control, and a desire to crush those who dared to challenge the system. And now they had crushed her brother. As the assembly ended and students filed out, still laughing and whispering, Amara rushed to the stage to wrap Malcolm in her arms. His body was cold, trembling like a leaf in a storm. "Malcolm, I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears mixing with the sweat on his forehead. But he didn't respond. His eyes were hollow, broken. The Jackson family hurried out of the auditorium, trying to shield Malcolm from the prying eyes and snickering students. The moment they reached the parking lot, Amara's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Stop digging if you want your family to stay safe." Amara's blood ran cold. She looked back at the school, where Thornton stood by the entrance, watching them leave with that same infuriating smile. The message was clear, he wasn't done with them yet. As they drove home in silence, Amara's mind was already racing. She had to find a way to expose Thornton for the monster he was. He would pay for what he did to her brother. She didn't know how yet, but she swore to herself that she would bring him down, no matter the cost. The drive back home from the school was tense and filled with a heavy, suffocating silence. In the back seat, Malcolm was huddled into himself, staring blankly out of the window. His eyes, once so bright with ambition, were now dull and distant, like he had retreated deep into his own mind to escape the pain of what just happened. Amara kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, her chest tightening with each lifeless blink he gave. Amara's mother, Cynthia, sat beside her, hands clenched together in her lap. Her knuckles were white, and her eyes were red-rimmed from the tears she had tried to hold back. Amara gripped the steering wheel harder, her knuckles almost as white as her mother's. Every mile closer to home only made her rage grow hotter. As soon as they pulled into the driveway, Malcolm bolted from the car and disappeared into the house, the door slamming shut behind him. The sound was like a gunshot in the still afternoon air, leaving a ringing in Amara's ears. She exchanged a worried glance with her mother. Cynthia sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the entire world had settled on them. "He won't talk," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Amara, what are we going to do?" Amara didn't have an answer. She was still too angry, too consumed by what she had witnessed. Thornton's smug face was all she could see whenever she closed her eyes. The way he had enjoyed humiliating her brother, turning him into nothing more than a spectacle for the whole school, it made her blood boil. But now, inside the house, there was a more pressing concern: Malcolm. Amara could hear the sound of something breaking from his room, a glass shattering, followed by the muffled sob of her brother's anguish. Without thinking, she rushed upstairs, her mother trailing behind her. "Malcolm?" Amara called softly as she knocked on his bedroom door. There was no response, just the sound of shuffling and a choked sob. Her heart ached for him. "It's me. Please open up." After a tense moment, the door creaked open just enough for Amara to slip inside. Malcolm was sitting on the floor amidst broken glass from a picture frame he had knocked over. The pieces glittered on the floor like tiny, jagged stars. He wouldn't look at her, his face hidden behind his hands. Amara slowly knelt beside him, careful not to touch the glass. "Malcolm, talk to me," she urged. "I'm so sorry. I should have done more to stop them." When Malcolm finally looked up, his eyes were filled with tears, but there was something darker beneath the surface. "What's the point, Amara?" "They hate us," he muttered, his voice cracking. "It doesn't matter what we do. We'll always be nothing to them." Amara's heart shattered at his words. This was exactly what Thornton wanted, for Malcolm to feel worthless, to break his spirit. She couldn't let that happen. Reaching out, she gently took his hand. "We are not nothing," she said fiercely. "You are not nothing. Thornton did this to you because he's afraid of what you can achieve." Malcolm just shook his head, withdrawing into himself again. The pain was too raw, too immediate. Amara knew there was nothing she could say in this moment to heal the wounds inflicted upon him. But she wasn't going to let Thornton win. Not like this. Back downstairs, Cynthia was pacing the living room. "We need to let it go, Amara," she said the moment her daughter appeared. "Going after Thornton will only make things worse. We can't afford to get involved with people like him." Amara turned on her mother, her anger barely contained. "So, we just let him get away with it. We let him destroy Malcolm's future. He's going to be scarred for life because of what happened today." Cynthia's eyes filled with tears again. "I'm trying to protect this family," she pleaded. "You don't know Thornton like I do. He's dangerous. Your father. What about Dad?" Amara cut her off, her voice sharper than she intended. "You've been dropping hints ever since we got home. What aren't you telling me?" For a moment, Cynthia looked like she was about to break down completely. Then, she took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "Your father, he tried to stand up to Thornton once," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Years ago, before he died. He tried to expose something about Thornton, and not long after that, he was gone." Amara's heart skipped a beat. "Are you saying?" But the look on her mother's face told her everything she needed to know. Suddenly, the humiliation Malcolm had faced today wasn't just about a cheating scandal. It was part of something much darker, something that had cost her father his life. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the tense silence. Pulling it out, she saw another message from the unknown number. "Stop now, or your family will suffer." Amara's hands shook as she read the text. This wasn't just about Malcolm anymore. Thornton was playing a long game, one that had started years ago, and he wasn't going to stop until he destroyed her family. But Amara wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let Thornton win. Clenching her jaw, she turned to her mother, eyes blazing with determination. "No," she said. "I won't stop. He's not going to destroy us like he did Dad. I'm going to find out what happened, and I'm going to make him pay." Her mother looked at her with a mix of fear and pride, but Amara didn't care. The line had been drawn, and there was no turning back. Thornton had made it personal. The sun had barely risen when Amara stepped out into the chilly morning air. She hadn't slept a wink. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of the previous day's events, the cryptic warnings, and the shocking revelation her mother had shared. The memory of Malcolm's tear-streaked face haunted her. Thornton had crossed a line, and she couldn't rest until she uncovered the truth behind his cruel actions. Amara made her way to the local cafe, hoping the caffeine would clear her head. She needed to come up with a plan, something that would get her closer to Thornton's secrets. She sat at a corner table, scrolling through her phone, sifting through social media posts about the humiliating punishment Malcolm had endured. Her brother's name was trending, and it made her sick to her stomach to see classmates mocking him online. But then, something caught her eye, a post from an anonymous account claiming to have witnessed Malcolm's exam papers being tampered with. The post was vague but included just enough detail to pique her curiosity. This might be the break I need, she thought. Without wasting another second, Amara sent a private message to the anonymous account, hoping for a response. As she waited, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The cafe had started to fill with the morning crowd, but the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. She quickly looked around but saw only the usual faces she recognized from the neighborhood. Her phone vibrated, startling her. A response had come through. "Meet me in the library at noon. Be discreet." Amara's heart skipped a beat. This was her chance, but it could also be a trap. She didn't have the luxury of trusting anyone, especially now that she knew how far Thornton would go to silence dissent. But if there was even a sliver of a chance that this lead was genuine, she had to take it. Amara entered the quiet, dimly lit library with caution. She scanned the room, looking for someone who might be expecting her. A figure waved at her from a secluded corner, a young woman with nervous eyes. Amara approached cautiously. "Are you the one who messaged me?" she asked, keeping her voice low. The woman nodded. "I'm Lena, a teacher at the high school," she whispered. "I'm sorry for what happened to your brother. It was wrong, but I'm scared to speak up. Thornton has eyes everywhere." Amara's pulse quickened. This was more than she had hoped for. "Why did you reach out to me? What do you know?" Lena hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "I saw Malcolm's exam papers before they were collected. They were clean, no sign of cheating. But when they were handed back from the board's office, there were marks all over them. Thornton's son, Derek, was the last one seen near the pile of exams." Amara clenched her fists, her anger bubbling up again. So, this was all a setup orchestrated by Thornton and his son. But why? What did they stand to gain from destroying Malcolm's reputation? "Why are you telling me this?" Amara asked, trying to gauge Lena's motives. "If Thornton finds out, he'll come after you too." Lena's eyes darted to the door. "I'm tired of living in fear," she confessed. "Your father, he tried to expose Thornton years ago. I didn't know the details, but I heard rumors. He was close to something big before her voice trailed off, the unspoken words hanging in the air. Amara's heart skipped a beat. Every clue seemed to lead back to her father's death. "What do you know about my dad?" she pressed, leaning in closer. "Please, anything you can tell me." "I only know that he had a file," Lena said hurriedly. "Something he was collecting on Thornton. But after your father died, that file disappeared." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but there were still too many gaps. If her father had been gathering evidence against Thornton, it meant he had discovered something that threatened the school board members' grip on power. "Do you know where I can find this file?" Amara asked, desperation creeping into her voice. Lena shook her head. "No, but there might be copies. Your father was thorough. If he kept records, he would have hidden them somewhere safe." Before Amara could press for more information, Lena's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her face turning pale. "I have to go," she whispered, panic rising in her voice. "Be careful, Amara. Thornton won't stop until he gets what he wants." And if he knows you're digging into your father's past? Amara nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. Thank you, Lena, she said softly. I promise I won't let him get away with this. As Lena hurried out of the library, Amara's mind was racing. Her father's death, Malcolm's humiliation, the threats, everything was connected. Thornton was hiding something, and her father had paid the ultimate price for trying to expose it. Determined to find out the truth, Amara knew her next step. She needed to search her father's old belongings for any hidden files. If he had kept evidence, it was up to her to find it. But as she left the library, her phone buzzed again with another anonymous message. Last warning. Stop now, or your brother will suffer more. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Thornton wasn't just playing games, he was serious. But she wasn't about to back down. Not now. The stakes were higher than ever, and the only way to protect her family was to uncover whatever secrets her father had died for. Amara stood in the doorway of the attic, staring at the dusty boxes that hadn't been touched since her father's death. The narrow space was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, casting shadows that danced across the cobweb-covered walls. It had been years since anyone had ventured up here. Now, with Lena's words ringing in her ears, she felt like she was on the verge of uncovering the secrets her father had left behind. She climbed the creaky wooden steps, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Her father's things had been left untouched since he died, out of respect and a lingering sense of grief. But now, Amara couldn't afford to hold back. If there was even a hint of evidence hidden here, she needed to find it, and fast. Pushing aside old photo albums and faded holiday decorations, she finally found a battered leather briefcase tucked away in a corner. She recognized it instantly, it had belonged to her father. Her hands trembled as she unclasped the rusted lock. The smell of aged paper and dust filled the air as she opened it. Inside, she found a stack of neatly filed papers, old notebooks, and manila folders. Amara's eyes widened as she pulled out a notebook labeled Thornton Investigation. Her father's familiar handwriting filled the pages with notes, dates, and names. The further she read, the more horrified she became. Thornton embezzling funds from the school district, bribery to secure contracts, threats against anyone who dared to expose him. The notebook detailed a web of corruption that spanned years. But what caught Amara's eye were the notes at the very end, frantic scribbles about someone named L.B., who was supposed to meet with her father days before his death. Amara's breath caught in her throat. This was bigger than she'd imagined. Her father hadn't just been looking into Thornton, he was about to expose a network of corruption that went far beyond the school board member. And that meant someone had silenced him before he could reveal the truth. As she flipped through the pages, she noticed one of the folders tucked at the bottom of the briefcase was missing several documents. It looked like someone had hastily removed files, leaving behind only partial evidence. Had her father hidden the rest somewhere else? Or had Thornton's men found them first? The sound of footsteps creaking on the stairs sent a jolt of panic through her. She quickly shoved the papers back into the briefcase and snapped it shut just as her mother's voice called up to her. Amara? Are you up there? Amara took a deep breath, steadying herself. Yeah, Mom, I'm here, she replied, trying to sound calm. She descended the stairs, hiding the briefcase behind her back. Her mother was standing at the bottom, worry lines etched deep into her forehead. What are you doing up there? Cynthia asked, her voice laced with concern. You know your father didn't want us going through his things. Amara hesitated, the weight of the secrets she'd just uncovered pressing down on her. But she couldn't keep her mother in the dark, not when their lives were at stake. Mom, there's something you need to know, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad was investigating Thornton before he died. He had evidence, real evidence, of what Thornton's been doing. Her mother's eyes widened in shock. Amara, no, Cynthia said, shaking her head furiously. You can't get involved in this. It's too dangerous. Thornton, he'll destroy you, just like he destroyed your father. Amara's jaw clenched. I can't walk away, Mom, she insisted. Malcolm's life was ruined because of Thornton and Dad. Dad died trying to expose him. I have to finish what he started. Cynthia's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. You're just like him, you know, she said softly, tears welling in her eyes. So stubborn. So determined to do what's right, no matter the cost. Amara wrapped her arms around her mother, holding her close. I promise I'll be careful, she whispered. But I can't let him win, Mom. Not after everything he's done to our family. As they stood there, embracing in the dimly lit hallway, Amara's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw another message from the unknown number. You're getting too close. Last chance to back off before things get worse. Her heart pounded. Thornton was getting desperate. But if he thought a few threats were going to scare her off, he was dead wrong. Amara turned to her mother, a newfound resolve in her eyes. I have to go, she said. I need to find out who LB is. It might be the key to everything. Her mother nodded reluctantly. Be safe, Amara, she pleaded. I can't lose you too. Amara squeezed her mother's hand, then hurried out the door. She had a lead now, a thread that might unravel the entire web of lies Thornton had spun. But she knew she was running out of time. The deeper she dug, the more dangerous it became, not just for her, but for everyone she loved. Amara drove through the quiet streets of her town, her mind racing with everything she had just discovered in her father's notes. The name LB lingered at the forefront of her thoughts. If she could figure out who this person was, she might finally find the missing pieces to her father's investigation. She felt like she was finally getting closer to the truth, but the closer she got, the more dangerous it became. As she turned a corner, her phone buzzed again with another message from the unknown number. I warned you. Now you'll see what happens when you don't listen. Amara's heart sank. The message sent chills down her spine, but she couldn't back down now. Thornton was trying to scare her into silence, just like he had done to so many others. But she refused to be intimidated. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her resolve hardening. When Amara pulled into her driveway, she immediately noticed something was wrong. The front door to their modest house was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. Fear clenched her stomach. She had left Malcolm and her mother at home before heading to the library earlier that day. What had Thornton done now? Amara's pulse quickened as she stepped out of the car and cautiously approached the house. The sound of broken glass crunching under her feet sent alarm bells ringing in her head. She pushed the door open wider, her eyes widening at the sight that greeted her. The living room was in complete disarray. Furniture had been overturned, and picture frames were smashed on the floor. It looked like a tornado had torn through their home. Panic surged through her as she called out, Mom? Malcolm? But the only response was the ominous silence that filled the air. Frantically, Amara ran through the house, her breath hitching in her throat. She found her mother in the kitchen, kneeling on the floor with her hands tied behind her back. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, and her eyes were wide with fear. Mom! Amara cried, rushing to her side. She quickly untied her mother's hands, her fingers trembling. What happened? Are you okay? Cynthia nodded weakly, wincing as she touched the cut on her forehead. They came looking for you, she whispered hoarsely. Thornton's men. They wanted to know what you found. Where's Malcolm? Amara demanded, fear clawing at her insides. They took him, her mother sobbed, her voice cracking. They said if you don't stop, they'll hurt him. Amara felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath her. She had been so focused on finding the truth that she hadn't realized how much danger she was putting her family in. Thornton had crossed a line. Kidnapping Malcolm was a new level of cruelty, and Amara knew he was using her brother as leverage to make her back off. Did they say where they were taking him? Amara asked urgently. Her mother shook her head, tears streaming down her face. All they said was that you would know what to do if you wanted to see him alive again. Amara's mind raced. This was Thornton's way of trapping her, forcing her to give up her investigation in exchange for Malcolm's safety. But if she stopped now, Thornton would win, and everything her father had fought for would be lost. She couldn't let that happen. She had to be smart, had to find a way to turn the tables on Thornton. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. If you want your brother back, meet me tonight at the old factory. Come alone. The old factory on the outskirts of town was notorious for being abandoned and isolated. It was the perfect place for Thornton to set his trap. But Amara had no choice. She couldn't risk Malcolm's life. She turned to her mother, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. I have to go. I'll get him back, I promise. No, Amara, her mother pleaded, grabbing her arm. This is what they want. You can't go alone. It's too dangerous. I don't have a choice, Amara replied, her eyes hardening. If I don't go, they'll hurt him. I have to do this. With that, Amara turned and sprinted out of the house, her heart pounding. She had to be smart about this. Thornton wanted her to come alone, but she couldn't afford to walk into a trap unprepared. She needed to gather evidence, to expose Thornton's cruelty to the world. But first, she had to save her brother. As she drove toward the old factory, Amara's mind whirled with possible plans. She couldn't rely on the police, they were in Thornton's pocket. This was a fight she had to handle on her own. The stakes had never been higher, and if she failed, she would not only lose Malcolm but risk everything her father had fought to uncover. The factory loomed ahead in the distance, its rusted metal frame silhouetted against the fading light of dusk. Amara took a deep breath, her heart racing as she prepared to face whatever Thornton had planned for her. She was stepping into the lion's den, and there was no turning back. The old factory loomed like a dark, twisted silhouette against the night sky, its broken windows resembling jagged teeth. Amara parked her car a safe distance away, the engine's rumble fading into silence. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she slipped her phone into her pocket. She had no backup, no plan, only a desperate hope that she could get Malcolm out safely. The sound of gravel crunching under her boots filled the empty space as she approached the factory's entrance. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay, and each step she took echoed through the hollow structure, amplifying the dread that gnawed at her insides. She tightened her grip on the flashlight she had brought, its narrow beam cutting through the darkness. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She fished it out with trembling hands, expecting another message from the anonymous number. Instead, it was a video message. Her heart lurched as she opened it. The grainy footage showed Malcolm, bound to a chair in a dimly lit room. His face was bruised, his eyes swollen from crying. A man's voice in the background, Thornton's unmistakable sneer, said, "If you want your brother to walk out of here alive, you'll do exactly as I say. No tricks, Amara. Come alone, or he suffers." Amara's knees almost gave way. This wasn't just a trap, it was a test of her resolve. Thornton knew she was desperate, and he was playing on her fear. But she wasn't about to let him win. Clutching her flashlight tighter, she pressed forward, determined to find her brother. As she entered the factory, the air grew colder, each breath visible in the thin beams of moonlight that filtered through the shattered windows. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant drip of water and the occasional scurrying of rats. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but the thought of Malcolm's suffering kept her moving forward. She had almost reached the center of the factory floor when she heard footsteps echoing behind her. Panic flared in her chest, and she spun around, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. A figure stepped out from the shadows. It was a young woman with dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail, her face partially obscured by the hood of her sweatshirt. Amara's heart raced. This wasn't Thornton, or at least, it didn't look like one of his goons. "Relax," the woman said, holding up her hands. "I'm not here to hurt you." Amara didn't lower her flashlight. "Who are you? Did Thornton send you?" "No," the woman replied, her voice urgent but soft. "My name is Isabella. I'm here to help you." Amara's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Help me? Why should I trust you?" Isabella stepped closer, lowering her hood to reveal a familiar face. Amara's eyes widened. She had seen this woman before, but she couldn't place where. Then it clicked, Isabella was Thornton's estranged daughter, the one who had left town years ago under mysterious circumstances. Amara's mind spun. This had to be another trick. "Why would Thornton's daughter be helping me?" she demanded. Isabella's expression hardened, and her eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and pain. "Because I'm nothing like him," she hissed. "My father is a monster. I left this town to get away from his corruption, but when I heard what he did to your brother, I couldn't stay silent any longer." Amara hesitated, her flashlight wavering. Was Isabella telling the truth? Could she really trust the daughter of the man who had caused her family so much pain? Seeing Amara's hesitation, Isabella continued. "Look, I know you have no reason to believe me, but I brought proof." She pulled out a USB drive from her pocket and handed it to Amara. "This contains everything I've gathered about my father's dirty dealings, embezzlement, bribery, blackmail. Your father tried to expose him, and that's why Thornton had him killed." Amara's breath caught in her throat. "What did you say?" Isabella nodded grimly. "Thornton orchestrated your father's death to protect his empire. I was there the night they planned it. That's why I left. I couldn't live with myself if I stayed." The ground seemed to shift beneath Amara's feet. The suspicions she had harbored for so long were true. Her father's death hadn't been an accident, it was cold-blooded murder. Thornton had silenced him, just as he was trying to silence her now. "But why are you helping me?" Amara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because I want to see my father brought to justice," Isabella said fiercely. "I've been gathering evidence for years, but I can't do it alone. With what your father started, we can finally bring him down. But right now, we need to get your brother out before it's too late." Amara's head was spinning. This was all happening so fast. But she couldn't afford to waste any more time. Malcolm's life was on the line, and if Isabella was telling the truth, she was the ally Amara desperately needed. "Okay," Amara said, her voice steadying. "What's the plan?" Isabella's eyes lit up with determination. "I know where they're holding him. But we have to be smart. Thornton's men are everywhere. If we're caught, it's over." The two women shared a tense look, a silent agreement passing between them. They were in this together now, whether Amara trusted her fully or not. They would have to rely on each other to survive this night. As they moved deeper into the factory, the air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to close in around them. The stakes had never been higher, and every step they took brought them closer to a showdown that could either save Malcolm's life, or cost them their own. The drive back from the factory was tense and silent. The information Isabella had shared with Amara had left her reeling. The revelation that Thornton had been behind her father's death was almost too much to process, but she couldn't afford to get lost in her emotions. Right now, Malcolm's life depended on her. Amara and Isabella made their way back to Amara's house to regroup and plan their next move. The adrenaline that had fueled Amara during her confrontation at the factory was slowly fading, replaced by a cold, gnawing fear. She was about to walk into the lion's den to save her brother, and one wrong move could mean disaster for both of them. As they pulled up to the house, Amara noticed several black SUVs parked outside. Her heart plummeted. Thornton's men had beaten her home. She turned to Isabella, panic in her eyes. "Stay here," Amara whispered urgently. "If things go south, get out and find help." Isabella nodded, but her face was set with determination. "I'm not leaving you, Amara. We're in this together." Taking a deep breath, Amara nodded and slipped out of the car. The moment she reached the porch, the front door burst open, and two burly men stormed out. They grabbed Amara roughly, twisting her arms behind her back. "Let her go!" Isabella shouted, rushing forward. But one of the men turned, pulling a gun from his waistband and pointing it at her. "Not another step, lady," he snarled. "Unless you want a bullet between your eyes." Amara struggled against the iron grip of the men holding her, but they were too strong. "Where's my brother?" she demanded, her voice a mix of fury and desperation. One of the men smirked. "You'll see him soon enough. But first, your mother has a little message for you." They dragged her into the house, with Isabella reluctantly following behind. Inside, the living room was a chaotic mess. Papers were strewn across the floor, the result of a frantic search. But it was the sight of her mother, Cynthia, that stopped Amara in her tracks. Cynthia was on her knees, her hands bound behind her back and a bruise blooming on her cheek. One of Thornton's men stood behind her with a gun pressed to the back of her head. The sight sent a wave of cold terror through Amara. "Mom," she cried, struggling harder against her captors. "Let her go, Thornton. This is between you and me." A cold laugh echoed from the shadows as Thornton himself stepped into view. He looked as smug as ever, his icy blue eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Oh, Amara," he drawled. "You really should have heeded my warnings. Now look at the mess you've made." Amara glared at him, her heart pounding. "Where's Malcolm?" she demanded again, refusing to show him any fear. Thornton's smile widened. "Safe, for now," he said. "But that can change very quickly, depending on how cooperative you are." He gestured to one of his men, who yanked Amara forward, forcing her to her knees beside her mother. "You've been quite the thorn in my side, you know that?" Thornton continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your father was the same, always sticking his nose where it didn't belong." Amara's eyes filled with fury. "My father was a good man. He was trying to expose you for the monster you are." Thornton's face darkened. "And look where that got him," he snapped. "Dead, leaving behind a family of fools who can't seem to learn their lesson." Amara felt a sob rising in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't break now. Not in front of Thornton. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice shaking. "It's simple," Thornton replied smoothly. "You're going to hand over every piece of evidence you've collected. All those files your father gathered, all the dirt Isabella has been leaking to you. Hand it over, and maybe, just maybe, I'll let your brother go." Amara's mind raced. If she gave up the evidence, Thornton would get away with everything: her father's death, Malcolm's humiliation, and the countless lives he had ruined. But if she refused, Malcolm's life hung in the balance. Before she could respond, her mother spoke up, her voice steady despite the gun pressed to her head. "Don't do it, Amara," Cynthia said, her eyes filled with fierce determination. "Don't let this monster win. Your father didn't die for nothing." Thornton's expression turned cold. "Enough of this nonsense," he growled. He gestured to the man holding Cynthia. "If she doesn't comply, kill the old woman." Amara's world seemed to slow down. She was on the brink of losing everything she loved, and she had no way out. But then, something shifted in her mother's eyes, something resolute and calm. Cynthia suddenly jerked forward, headbutting the man holding her. The gun went off, the bullet missing by inches as Amara screamed. The distraction was enough for Isabella to leap into action, tackling one of the men and disarming him. The room erupted into chaos. Amara lunged for Thornton, but he was already fleeing toward the back door, leaving his men to fend for themselves. In the confusion, Amara's mother stumbled toward her, blood trickling from a fresh wound on her arm. "Go, Amara!" Cynthia gasped, pushing her toward the door. "Find Malcolm. Save him. I'll hold them off." "No, Mom, I can't leave you," Amara cried, her voice breaking. "You have to," Cynthia insisted, her eyes blazing with determination. "Malcolm needs you. Your father, he would want you to finish this." Tears streamed down Amara's face as she nodded. She hugged her mother tightly, then turned and sprinted toward the door where Isabella was waiting. They had to move fast before Thornton regrouped. But as she fled the house, the sound of gunfire behind her sent a shiver down her spine. She couldn't look back. Not now. She had to save Malcolm. But as she raced into the night, the weight of her mother's sacrifice pressed heavily on her heart. The night was pitch black as Amara and Isabella fled through the dense woods behind the Jackson house. The air was cold, their breaths coming in shallow, frantic gasps as they sprinted away from the chaos they'd left behind. The sounds of gunfire and shouting still echoed faintly in the distance, making Amara's heart race even faster. Her mother's sacrifice had bought them precious time, but she couldn't shake the gnawing guilt that she had left her behind. "Are you sure this is the way?" Isabella asked, her voice barely a whisper between labored breaths. Amara nodded, her mind focused on the task at hand. "Yes, there's an old service road that leads out of here. We can follow it to the warehouse where they're holding Malcolm," she said, pushing aside branches that slapped at her face as they ran. The forest seemed to close in around them, every shadow a potential threat. But Amara couldn't afford to be afraid. Malcolm's life depended on her, and she couldn't let her mother's sacrifice be in vain. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the narrow, overgrown road. Isabella pulled Amara to a stop, panting heavily. "We need to plan," she said, her voice urgent. "Thornton won't hesitate to kill Malcolm if we just barge in there." Amara paused, trying to catch her breath, her thoughts racing. "You're right," she admitted reluctantly. "We need to be smart about this." She pulled out the USB drive Isabella had given her earlier, her only leverage against Thornton. "This is our best chance. If we can broadcast this evidence, it will expose everything Thornton has done." Isabella's eyes darted to the USB drive, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. But before Amara could question it, the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel made her spin around. A group of Thornton's men emerged from the shadows, their guns raised. Hands in the air, one of the men barked, his flashlight blinding Amara. She exchanged a panicked look with Isabella, who seemed frozen in place. "What the? How did they find us?" Amara whispered, her mind racing. There was no way they could have tracked them so quickly, unless someone had led them here. Amara's heart sank as realization dawned. She turned to Isabella, her voice trembling with disbelief. You betrayed me, didn't you?" Isabella's face crumpled, but she couldn't meet Amara's eyes. "I had no choice," she confessed in a choked whisper. "Thornton found out that I was helping you. He threatened to kill my mother if I didn't lure you out." Amara's hands shook with rage and betrayal. "You used me," she hissed. "You let my mother get hurt, all for your own family?" Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Amara. I thought I could protect you both, but Thornton, he's too powerful. I never wanted it to go this far." Before Amara could respond, the leader of the group stepped forward, roughly grabbing her by the arm. "Enough talking," he growled. "Thornton wants to see you both." Amara's mind whirled as they were forced down the road, guns pressed into their backs. Isabella walked beside her, her shoulders slumped, the weight of her betrayal heavy in the air between them. Amara's thoughts were a chaotic storm of anger, fear, and desperation. She had been so close to saving Malcolm, but now, everything was falling apart. As they approached the warehouse at the end of the road, the faint glow of lights flickered through the cracks in the building's rusted metal walls. The place reeked of oil and decay, a fitting setting for the nightmare that awaited them inside. The men shoved them into the dimly lit space, where Thornton stood waiting, his smile as cold and predatory as ever. Behind him, Malcolm was tied to a chair, his face bruised and bloodied. Amara's heart twisted at the sight of her brother's swollen eyes, but she bit back her tears. Showing weakness would only give Thornton more power. "Well, Thornton drawled, stepping forward. "I must say, I'm impressed you made it this far, Amara. But I warned you what would happen if you continued to defy me." Amara's rage bubbled over, but she kept her voice steady. "You're a coward, Thornton. You hide behind threats and guns because you're afraid of the truth coming out." Thornton chuckled, clearly amused. "The truth?" he sneered. "The truth is, you're just like your father, too naive to realize that power always wins. And now, you're going to lose everything." Amara's mind raced. She still had the USB drive, hidden in her pocket. If she could find a way to broadcast the files, she could still expose Thornton's crimes. But with guns trained on her and Malcolm's life hanging in the balance, any wrong move could end in disaster. As if reading her thoughts, Thornton gestured to one of his men. "Search her," he commanded. Amara's heart pounded as the man approached. In a desperate move, she turned to Isabella, hoping for some last shred of loyalty. "Isabella, please," she pleaded. "If there's any part of you that wants to do the right thing, help me." Isabella's eyes were filled with tears, but she remained frozen, paralyzed by fear. I can't," she whispered. The man roughly patted Amara down, pulling the USB drive from her pocket. Thornton's eyes gleamed with triumph as he snatched it from the guard's hand. "Nice try," he taunted. "But it looks like you won't be needing this anymore." Amara's heart sank as Thornton crushed the USB drive under his boot, the last piece of evidence against him now shattered into pieces. She had lost everything, her chance to expose Thornton, her brother's freedom, and the trust she had placed in Isabella. As the guards dragged her and Isabella toward the back of the warehouse, Amara's thoughts turned to her father and mother. They had sacrificed so much to stand up against Thornton, and now it seemed like all their efforts had been in vain. But deep inside, a spark of defiance still burned. Thornton may have won this battle, but Amara wasn't done fighting. She would find a way to turn the tables, even if it was the last thing she ever did. The harsh, fluorescent lights of the warehouse flickered ominously as Amara was shoved into a cold, damp room. The steel door slammed shut behind her, the sound reverberating like a death knell in the still air. She was alone now, separated from Isabella and Malcolm. Her heart pounded with fear, but also with determination. She couldn't afford to lose hope, not when time was running out. Through the small, barred window of the door, Amara could hear Thornton's men talking, their voices a murmur against the hum of the building's ventilation system. She pressed her ear to the cold metal, straining to catch their words. "Thornton wants this wrapped up tonight," one of them said. "No loose ends. The boss is sick of playing games with that girl." Amara's blood ran cold. Tonight. That meant she had only a few hours to figure out a plan. The ticking clock felt like it was inside her head, each second slipping away faster than the last. She had lost the USB drive, her last piece of evidence, but she wasn't done yet. Thornton had underestimated her resolve. Suddenly, A faint sound from the far corner of the room caught her attention, a rustling, like fabric against concrete. Amara turned, squinting in the dim light, and froze. There, crouched behind a stack of old crates, was Lena, the teacher who had initially helped her. "Lena?" Amara whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you doing here?" Lena crawled out from her hiding spot, her face pale and bruised. "I've been hiding here since I escaped," she said, her voice shaky. "Thornton's men caught me trying to leak more information. I overheard everything. They're planning to kill your brother once they're done with you." The words hit Amara like a punch to the gut. Her worst fears were coming true. "We have to stop them," she said urgently. "We don't have much time." Lena nodded, a grim look in her eyes. "I know a way out of here," she whispered. "But it's risky. If we can get to the security room, I can access the building's communication system. There's still a chance to broadcast what your father found. Thornton doesn't know I have a copy of the files hidden." Amara's heart leaped with renewed hope. "You have a copy?" she asked, her voice a hushed whisper. "But how do we get to it without getting caught?" Lena glanced at the door. "The guards change shifts in 5 minutes," she said. "It's the only window we have. Once we're out, we need to reach the control room on the 2nd floor. That's where they monitor everything." Amara's mind raced. This was their last shot. She couldn't afford to hesitate. "All right," she said, her resolve hardening. "Let's do it." As the minutes ticked by, Amara and Lena crouched by the door, listening for the telltale sound of the guards switching shifts. The moment the footsteps faded, Lena eased the door open, her hands shaking slightly. The hallway outside was empty, bathed in the dim glow of emergency lights. "Stay close," Lena whispered. They moved quickly and quietly, sticking to the shadows, their breaths held tight in their throats. The factory's labyrinthine corridors twisted and turned, each corner potentially hiding another one of Thornton's goons. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the stairwell leading up to the 2nd floor. But just as they began to ascend, they heard the sound of voices and footsteps approaching. There was no time to run. Amara grabbed Lena's arm and pulled her into a dark alcove, pressing themselves flat against the wall as 2 guards walked past. "Boss said to prepare the prisoner," one guard muttered. "The girl's brother isn't going to last much longer." Amara's fists clenched. Malcolm's time was running out, and every second they wasted was one he didn't have. As soon as the guards were out of sight, she and Lena bolted up the stairs, their footsteps echoing softly in the narrow stairwell. The control room was just ahead. The door was ajar, and Amara could see the glow of monitors inside. She peered in cautiously and spotted only one guard inside, leaning back in his chair with his feet up on the console. Amara signaled to Lena, who nodded and crept to the other side of the doorway. With a silent count of 3, Amara burst into the room, grabbing a heavy metal pipe she had found earlier. She swung it hard, catching the guard off guard and sending him sprawling to the floor, unconscious. Lena rushed to the control panel, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "This will take a minute," she whispered frantically. "I just need to connect to the external network." Amara stood guard by the door, her heart pounding. "Hurry," she urged. "We don't have much time." The sound of alarms blaring suddenly filled the air, and Amara's heart skipped a beat. They had been discovered. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall, getting closer. "Lena, we need to move." "Got it," Lena exclaimed. "The files are broadcasting now. Everyone in town will see what Thornton has been hiding." Amara felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived as the door burst open and Thornton's men stormed in. There was no time to escape. The guards grabbed Amara and Lena, dragging them away from the control panel. Thornton's furious face appeared in the doorway, his eyes blazing with rage. You think you've won? He snarled. It doesn't matter what you broadcast. By the time anyone sees it, you'll both be dead. Amara spat blood from her lip, refusing to let him see her fear. You're finished, Thornton, she hissed. The truth is out. There's nowhere left for you to hide. But as Thornton's cruel smile widened, Amara knew this was far from over. They had bought themselves some time, but Malcolm was still in danger. The clock was still ticking, and if they didn't find a way out of this, all their efforts would have been for nothing. Amara's hands were bound tightly behind her back as Thornton's men shoved her and Lena into the center of the old warehouse floor. The heavy steel doors clanged shut behind them, sealing them into what felt like a tomb. The air was thick with the stench of oil and mildew, the faint glow of flickering fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows across the space. They had managed to broadcast the files, but now they were trapped, and Malcolm was still nowhere to be found. Thornton stood in front of them, his eyes gleaming with a mix of fury and twisted satisfaction. You really thought you could expose me? He sneered, pacing in front of them like a predator circling its prey. Do you have any idea how many people I own in this town? By the time anyone sees that broadcast, it'll be too late. Amara met his gaze, refusing to look away despite the fear gnawing at her insides. You're finished, Thornton, she said, her voice steady. People have seen the files. They know what you've done. You can't silence everyone. Thornton's smile twisted into a cruel smirk. Oh, but I don't need to, he said softly, leaning closer to her. I only need to silence you. He turned to one of his men. Bring the boy, he ordered coldly. Amara's heart dropped as she heard the sound of shuffling footsteps. A moment later, Malcolm was dragged into the room, his hands bound and his face swollen with fresh bruises. His eyes widened when he saw Amara, tears spilling down his cheeks. Amara, he whispered, his voice choked with pain. Malcolm. Amara cried, struggling against her restraints. Let him go, Thornton. He's just a kid. But Thornton's expression was devoid of pity. You brought this on him, he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. If you had just stayed out of my business, your brother wouldn't have to suffer. Amara's rage flared, but she forced herself to stay calm. She needed to think, to find a way out of this. Lena was beside her, her face pale but determined. They had one last chance, but they had to be smart about it. Thornton turned to one of his men, nodding. The thug pulled out a gun, pressing it to the back of Malcolm's head. This is how it ends, Thornton said, looking at Amara with cold, unblinking eyes. Unless you tell me exactly who helped you. Amara's heart raced. If she gave up Lena, Thornton would kill her too, and if she said nothing, Malcolm's life would be over in seconds. Sweat trickled down her temple as she desperately searched for a way out. Suddenly, the warehouse doors burst open, flooding the room with the flashing red and blue lights of police cars. The piercing sound of sirens filled the air. Thornton's eyes widened in shock, and for the first time, Amara saw a flicker of fear in his gaze. What is this? Thornton shouted, turning on his men. Who? In the chaos, Lena sprang into action. With her hands still bound, she charged at the thug holding Malcolm, ramming her shoulder into him and sending the gun skittering across the floor. Amara took the opportunity to slam her body into the guard beside her, throwing him off balance. As Thornton's men scrambled to regain control, officers stormed into the warehouse, their guns drawn. Hands in the air. Nobody move, one of them shouted. Amara's relief was short-lived as Thornton grabbed Malcolm, using him as a human shield. I'm not going down for this, he growled, his eyes wild with desperation. You think you've won, Amara? I can still make you suffer. Amara's heart pounded as she locked eyes with her brother. Stay strong, Malcolm, she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. She turned her gaze to Thornton, her mind racing. Let him go, Thornton. It's over. The evidence is out there. The police are here. You can't escape this. But Thornton's grip on Malcolm only tightened. If I'm going down, I'm taking him with me, he shouted, dragging Malcolm toward a side exit. Amara acted on instinct. With her hands still bound, she lunged forward, ramming into Thornton with all her strength. The force sent him stumbling, loosening his grip on Malcolm just enough for the boy to wriggle free. "Run, Malcolm!" Amara screamed. "Get out of here!" Malcolm didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the police, who quickly pulled him to safety. But Thornton wasn't done. Furious and cornered, he swung around, raising the gun he had managed to grab in the chaos. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. Thornton's finger tightened on the trigger, aiming directly at Amara. She braced herself, expecting the searing pain of a bullet. But the shot never came. Instead, a deafening crack echoed through the warehouse as Lena tackled Thornton from behind, throwing off his aim. The gunshot rang out, but it hit the ceiling harmlessly. In the next instant, the police swarmed Thornton, wrestling him to the ground. Breathing hard, Amara stumbled to her feet, her hands finally free as an officer cut her restraints. She rushed to Malcolm, pulling him into a tight embrace. Tears streamed down both their faces, but they were safe. For now. Lena approached them, her face streaked with sweat and dirt, but a triumphant smile on her lips. "I told you," she said softly to Amara. "We could stop him." Amara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "We did it," she whispered. "We really did it." But as she looked around at the chaos, the police arresting Thornton and his men, the flashing lights, the shattered remains of their lives, she knew that this was just the beginning. Thornton's empire had crumbled, but the fight for justice was far from over. Amara held Malcolm close, her heart filled with both relief and a fierce determination. They had survived the night, but there were still battles left to fight. And she would see them through, no matter the cost. The early morning sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across the town as Amara and Malcolm sat together on the steps of the police station. The adrenaline from the night's events was slowly wearing off, leaving them both feeling exhausted and hollow. But for the first time in weeks, there was a small glimmer of hope. Malcolm leaned his head against Amara's shoulder, his bruised face etched with fatigue. "I thought I was never going to see you again," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Amara wrapped her arm around him, pulling him closer. "I promised I'd get you back," she said softly. "And I always keep my promises." The door to the station swung open, and Lena stepped out, accompanied by Detective Harris, the lead officer on the case. The detective was a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She had been the first to believe Amara's story when the broadcast of Thornton's corruption went live. "We've arrested Thornton and most of his men," Harris said as she approached. "The files you broadcasted exposed a lot of his illegal activities. It's all over the news now. He won't be able to buy his way out of this one." Amara felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was tempered by the exhaustion that pulled at every muscle in her body. "Thank you, Detective," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I wasn't sure if anyone would believe us." Harris nodded, a faint smile playing at the corner of her lips. "Your father was a good man, Amara. He tried to do the right thing, but he was silenced before he could finish the job. I've been waiting a long time to take Thornton down, but I didn't have enough evidence. You and Lena changed that." Lena stepped forward, her face a mixture of relief and lingering guilt. "I'm just glad we could stop him before anyone else got hurt," she said, her eyes meeting Amara's. "I know you'll never fully forgive me for what happened back there, but I'm truly sorry." Amara studied Lena's face for a long moment. The betrayal still stung, but she could see the genuine remorse in Lena's eyes. "You made up for it," Amara said quietly. You risked your life to help me save Malcolm. That's what matters now. Lena nodded, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know what's next for me, but I'm glad I could do something good before it was too late. Detective Harris cleared her throat, her expression turning serious. Amara, I need you to come inside and officially give your statement. We're going to make sure Thornton stays behind bars, but we need everything documented. Amara sighed, exhaustion threatening to drag her under, but she nodded. I'll do whatever it takes, she said. But can Malcolm stay here with you? She glanced down at her brother, who had fallen asleep on her shoulder. He's been through enough. Harris's stern expression softened. Of course, she said. We'll make sure he's safe. You've both been through hell, but it's almost over. As Amara followed Harris back into the police station, she couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and lingering anxiety. Thornton was behind bars, but the damage he had caused would take a long time to heal. Her father's death, her mother's injuries, Malcolm's trauma, these were scars that wouldn't fade easily. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense but buzzing with energy. Officers were busy processing the evidence Amara and Lena had managed to gather. The broadcast had gone viral, reaching not only the town but the entire state. Journalists were already clamoring for details outside the building, their voices a muffled roar beyond the station's doors. Amara took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. As she sat down with Detective Harris to give her statement, she recounted everything she knew, her father's investigation, the evidence Thornton had tried to bury, and the nightmarish events of the past few days. The words tumbled out of her in a rush, a release of all the fear, pain, and determination she had held inside. By the time she finished, her throat was dry, and her hands were trembling. Harris gave her a reassuring nod. You did good, Amara, she said. This town owes you a debt. We'll make sure Thornton pays for what he's done. Amara nodded wearily. I just want my family to be safe, she said. That's all that matters now. Hours later, Amara stepped out of the police station to find a small crowd gathered outside. As she emerged, there was a moment of stunned silence before a wave of applause erupted. Neighbors, classmates, and even strangers had come to show their support. They had seen the broadcast, had watched as the truth about Thornton was laid bare, and they were here to thank the girl who had risked everything to take him down. Amara's eyes filled with tears as she looked out at the crowd, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and gratitude. She had done it. Her father's fight, Malcolm's suffering, her mother's sacrifice, it hadn't been in vain. But as the crowd surged forward, thanking her, hugging her, she couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had happened. Thornton might be in jail, but the scars he had left on her family would take a long time to heal. As she turned to find Malcolm in the crowd, she felt a familiar hand on her shoulder. It was Lena, looking both nervous and hopeful. What's next for you? She asked softly. Amara looked at the sky, the first rays of dawn breaking through the darkness. I don't know, she admitted. But I do know one thing, I'm not done fighting. There are more people like Thornton out there, and they need to be stopped. Lena nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. Whatever you decide, I'll be right there with you, she said. Amara took a deep breath, the weight of the past few days lifting just a little. The fight was far from over, but for now, she had won a small victory. And with her brother safe and her town waking up to a new day, she was ready to face whatever came next. The first rays of dawn were breaking as Amara stood on the front porch of her family's house, looking out over the neighborhood that was slowly waking up. It had been less than 24 hours since Thornton was arrested, but it felt like a lifetime. Everything had changed, yet so much remained uncertain. Amara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of soft footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Malcolm stepping out of the house, still moving gingerly from his injuries. He was wrapped in one of their mother's old blankets, his face pale but showing the smallest hint of a smile. "Couldn't sleep?" Amara asked softly, moving aside to make room for him on the porch. Malcolm shook his head, his eyes downcast. "Too many nightmares," he confessed. "I keep seeing them, the men, Thornton, everything that happened." Amara's heart ached for him. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't erase the trauma that Thornton had inflicted on her brother. But as she wrapped her arm around him, she knew they would face this new reality together. "We'll get through it," she said firmly. "One step at a time." Malcolm nodded, leaning into her embrace. For a moment, they stood in silence, watching as the sun slowly crept over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. It was a new day, a chance to start over, to heal, and to rebuild. The sound of a car pulling up broke the stillness. Amara turned to see Detective Harris stepping out of her unmarked vehicle, her face drawn but hopeful. She walked up the driveway, giving Amara a tired smile. "Good morning," Harris said, her tone gentler than usual. "I wanted to check on you and Malcolm, see how you're holding up." Amara nodded gratefully. We're okay, I think," she said, her voice catching slightly. "It's just going to take some time." Harris nodded, her eyes flicking to Malcolm, who offered a small wave. "I have some good news," she said, turning her attention back to Amara. "Thornton's arraignment is scheduled for tomorrow morning. With all the evidence you and Lena gathered, it's unlikely he'll be able to post bail. He'll be behind bars for a long time." Amara let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "I can't believe it's really over," she murmured, shaking her head. "But it's not going to bring my father back. Or undo what he did to Malcolm." "No, it won't," Harris agreed, her voice softening. "But it's a start. And because of you, this town is finally waking up to the corruption that's been festering here for years. People are demanding change." Amara nodded slowly, a new determination sparking in her eyes. "I just wish my father could have lived to see it," she said quietly. "He fought so hard for justice." "Your father would be proud of you," Harris said firmly. "You finished what he started. And you've given this town a chance to heal." As Harris drove away, Amara turned back to the house, where her mother was standing in the doorway, leaning heavily on a cane. The injuries she had sustained during Thornton's attack would take months to fully heal, but Cynthia's spirit was unbroken. "Detective Harris seems like a good person," Cynthia said as Amara approached. "She's been a blessing through all of this." Amara nodded. "We wouldn't have been able to bring Thornton down without her help," she agreed. "But it's not over yet. We need to make sure this kind of thing never happens again." Cynthia's eyes softened with pride. "I'm proud of you, Amara," she said, reaching out to cup her daughter's cheek. "You've grown into a woman your father would have been proud to call his own." Amara swallowed the lump in her throat, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I'm just trying to do what he would have done," she whispered. Her mother nodded, her expression turning thoughtful. "So, what's next for you, Amara? You fought so hard to expose the truth, but you can't keep fighting forever." Amara looked out over the neighborhood, a sense of clarity washing over her. "I think it's time to take the next step," she said slowly. "I've been offered a scholarship to study law, and maybe that's how I can keep fighting. Legally, this time." Cynthia's eyes widened with surprise. "Law school?" she asked. "Are you sure that's what you want?" Amara nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Yes. I want to be the kind of lawyer who can actually make a difference. There are too many people like Thornton out there, hiding behind money and power. If I can stop just one of them, maybe it'll be worth it." Malcolm, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "And I want to go back to school," he said, his voice shaking slightly but filled with resolve. "I won't let them take my future away." Amara turned to her brother, her eyes shining with pride. "That's the spirit, Malcolm," she said, pulling him into another hug. "We're not going to let anyone stop us from living our lives." The next few weeks flew by in a blur of court dates, interviews, and rebuilding their shattered lives. The town was slowly changing. People were coming forward with their own stories of corruption, emboldened by Amara's bravery. Thornton's empire of fear and control was crumbling piece by piece. One afternoon, as Amara was packing boxes in preparation for her move to the city for law school, Lena stopped by. She looked healthier, her eyes no longer haunted by the fear that had driven her into hiding. "I just wanted to thank you," Lena said, handing Amara a small envelope. "This is for your tuition. I know it's not much, but consider it a thank you for giving me a second chance." Amara was speechless as she opened the envelope to find a check inside. "Lena, you don't have to." "I want to," Lena insisted. "You gave me a chance to do something good with my life. It's the least I can do." Amara hugged Lena tightly, the bond they had forged through the fire of their shared ordeal stronger than ever. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." On the morning of her departure for law school, Amara stood on the porch, taking one last look at the house where so much had happened. Malcolm and her mother stood beside her, their faces filled with hope. "You'll come visit, right?" Malcolm asked, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the tremor in his voice. "Of course," Amara promised. "I'm not leaving you behind. This is just a new beginning." As she drove away, the sun rising in her rearview mirror, Amara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had fought for justice, for her family, for the memory of her father. And now, she was ready to face whatever the future held. The fight wasn't over, but Amara knew she was strong enough to face whatever came next. This time, she wouldn't be fighting alone.